The afternoon my son set his teaspoon down on the saucer 3 times. I almost missed it. I was halfway through buttering a scone, only half listening to Imogen explain her work at the veterinary clinic, something about a new rostering system and a manager she was learning to like, when I heard it. 3 soft clicks. Silver against china. So quiet the kettle on the hob nearly covered them. I looked up. My son was smiling at her, nodding along, his hands resting easy on the tablecloth. To anyone else in that kitchen, nothing had happened. But I taught him that signal when he was 10 years old, on a rainy afternoon in Wellington, and I had never once heard him use it since. Let me back up. My name is Duncan Kerrigan. I'm 63 years old. And for 34 years I worked as a senior investigator with the New Zealand Customs Service, mostly out of the Auckland office, though my last 7 years I spent leading a small financial crimes unit that dealt with commercial fraud and money laundering. It wasn't the glamorous side of customs work. No drug busts, no dramatic raids on the wharf. What I did was sit across tables from people who had built careful lies, and I listened to them until I could hear the shape of what they weren't saying. I retired 2 years ago. My wife, Margaret, passed 5 years ago now, from a cancer that we thought we had time to fight, and then suddenly did not. She was a school teacher in Howick for 28 years, and half the families in that suburb still stop me at the supermarket to tell me stories about her I've never heard before. After she died, the house in Bucklands Beach felt like a museum of a woman I could no longer talk to. The first year I barely managed. The second year I started a small vegetable garden, not because I wanted one, but because Margaret had always wanted one, and I felt I owed her the tomatoes. By the time I retired, the garden had become something I loved, and the house had stopped echoing. My son, Nathaniel, is 34. He works as a structural engineer in Auckland, at a firm that does a lot of the new commercial towers along the waterfront. He has his mother's way of listening, that patient, head-tilted attention that makes people tell her things they hadn't meant to say. And he has my stubbornness, which has served him in his career and cost him a few friendships over the years. He's a careful man, thoughtful about everything. He married once, when he was 26, to a woman named Claire. It lasted 18 months. She was a good person. I liked her, but she wanted a life in Melbourne, and he wanted a life here, and neither of them was willing to lose themselves for the other. They parted without bitterness, which Margaret always said was the mark of people who had genuinely loved each other. After the divorce, Nathaniel didn't date for almost 4 years. He buried himself in work, took on a master's degree part-time, finished it last year. He came to Sunday lunch every fortnight, and we talked about bridges and budget reports and the garden. And I stopped asking about his personal life because it seemed to hurt him when I did. So when he rang me last October to say he'd been seeing someone and that he'd like to bring her round, I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard in a long time. A lightness, the way his vowels rounded out at the end of the sentence. The way they used to when he was a boy, telling me about a good day at school. Her name is Imogen Whitcomb, he said. She's a veterinary nurse at a practice in Remuera. She's 31. I wrote her name down. Old habit. 34 years of customs work doesn't leave you easily. I asked how they had met. Through a mutual friend, he said. A colleague of hers who had used Nathaniel's firm for a renovation consultation. They had been seeing each other for 5 months before he mentioned her to me, which told me something on its own. Nathaniel doesn't share things until he's fairly certain of them. We agreed she would come to Sunday lunch the following weekend. I told him I'd make a lamb roast, which is the only thing I cook well enough to serve to strangers. He laughed and said she would like that, and we hung up, and I sat in the kitchen for a while thinking about Margaret and how she would have already run 3 searches on Imogen Whitcomb before I finished buttering my toast. I did the searches anyway. I'm not proud of it, but I also won't apologize for it. A veterinary nurse at Remuera Animal Hospital, 31 years old. listed on the practice website with a short, pleasant biography about her love of greyhound rescue. A LinkedIn profile that was sparse but consistent, showing a diploma from Massey University and 2 previous roles at smaller clinics, one in Hamilton, one in Tauranga. Her Facebook was set to private. Her Instagram had perhaps 60 photographs, mostly of dogs at the clinic. A few of a tramping trip in the Tongariro area. A couple of a nephew's birthday in Christchurch. Nothing I found was alarming. Nothing I found was reassuring either. In my experience, people who have nothing to hide tend to leave slightly messier digital traces. Real lives have more inconsistencies than carefully curated ones, but I wasn't prepared to read anything into that. I told myself, as I had told myself many times with Nathaniel, that I would lead with trust. I would give him the benefit of my own doubts. The Sunday she came was a bright October afternoon. One of those Auckland spring days where the pohutukawa buds are just starting to swell and the harbor looks bluer than it has any right to be. They arrived 16 minutes early, I noticed. Imogen had brought a bunch of Stargazer lilies, Margaret's favorite, which I hadn't told Nathaniel she was bringing, because he wouldn't have known to tell her. She said she'd seen them at the florist and thought the kitchen might like some color. She was pretty in a warm, unfussy way. Hair pulled back, small silver earrings, a pale green jumper over jeans. She shook my hand firmly and looked me in the eye and said, "I've heard so much about you, Mr. Kerrigan. I was hoping we'd like each other." It was a disarming thing to say. Honest. Vulnerable. The right note for a first meeting with a widowed father. I watched Nathaniel watch her say it. His face had the particular softness I remembered from his mother, the one Margaret used to get when she was quietly deciding she loved someone. We sat in the kitchen because I've never been able to bring myself to use the dining room since Margaret died. The lamb was a bit dry, but the kumara mash was good, and Imogen ate like a woman who genuinely enjoyed food, which is something I have always noticed about people. She asked about the garden. She noticed the photograph of Margaret on the dresser, the one from our anniversary trip to the Bay of Islands. And she didn't say anything clever about it. She just looked for a moment, and then turned away and asked Nathaniel to pass the gravy. It was the right choice. I registered it the way you register a door, closing softly in another room. She talked about the clinic, about a Rottweiler called Banjo, who had learned to open the surgery fridge, about a rostering change that had split the staff into 2 unhappy camps. She had opinions, but spoke gently about her colleagues. She asked me about customs work, listened to my answers, asked follow-up questions that weren't generic. "What do you do when you know someone is guilty but can't prove it?" she asked at one point. I gave her my standard answer, which is that you go home and sleep poorly and come back in the morning and try again. She laughed at that, a real laugh. She was warm. She was observant. She was, in every way I could measure across a Sunday lunch, exactly the sort of woman I would have wanted my son to find. We were somewhere past the main course. The lamb mostly gone. Imogen refilling her water glass from the jug. When the conversation moved to money, it moved there the way money always moves into conversations in this country, sideways, half apologetic, masked as something else. Nathaniel was talking about the firm's push into Queenstown, a new development they were consulting on, and he mentioned almost in passing that his share of a small inheritance from his maternal grandfather had finally cleared probate that winter. Margaret's father had left him a block of land on the Coromandel, not worth a fortune but not nothing, and with the current market, Nathaniel had been turning over what to do with it. Imogen made an interested noise. She said, with a tone that was careful rather than eager, that her younger brother had been looking for somewhere to buy near Whitianga, and if Nathaniel ever wanted to sell, it might be worth a conversation. "Small world," she said. And she laughed. And Nathaniel laughed. And the moment moved past. 3 clicks. Teaspoon against saucer. My hand stopped on the butter knife. I kept my face still. Here is the thing about a signal like ours. It only works if both people remember, and I had not been certain Nathaniel would remember ours. We had invented it when he was 10, during the year Margaret was doing her graduate diploma and often out in the evenings, and I was handling bedtime and homework on my own. Nathaniel had been having trouble at a friend's house. Small things. An older brother who teased too hard, a father who drank too much on Fridays. He couldn't bring himself to say he didn't want to go over there anymore. Margaret and I had talked it through, and I had sat him on the steps of our veranda one rainy afternoon and said, "If you're ever somewhere and something feels wrong and you can't find the words, use the signal. 3 taps. Anything against anything. I'll know what you mean. I'll come get you. You won't have to explain." He had used it twice as a boy. Once at that friend's house. Once at a birthday party, where he'd overheard an adult say something frightening. After that, never. He was 34 years old at my kitchen table, and he had just used the signal. I looked at him. He was still smiling at Imogen, still nodding at something she was saying about Whitianga in summer, but his left hand was resting flat on the table in a way I recognized. Margaret used to do that. When she was holding something in, I took a slow sip of water. I picked up the butter knife again. "So," I said, "Imogen, tell me more about your brother. Is he in property? Or was this for himself to live in?" She turned to me. "For himself," she said. "He's a builder, actually. He's been saving for years. He keeps missing out at auction. You know how it is at the moment." "Of course," I said. "And have you helped him look before?" It was a small question. Too small for anyone to flag. She answered it smoothly. She said yes. She'd been his second set of eyes on a few places. She named 2 suburbs. She described a townhouse in Glen Eden that had gone to a cash buyer at the last minute. Everything she said was plausible. Everything she said was also impossible to verify over a Sunday lunch. I smiled. I nodded. I asked another question, a slightly different angle, and she answered that one too. And by the time the pavlova came out, I had 3 small things I could not quite match together, but which together felt like the edge of a shape I recognized. She left around 4, kissing Nathaniel on the cheek, squeezing my arm gently at the door, thanking me again for the roast. Nathaniel walked her to her car. He came back inside looking settled in a way that hurt my chest. He washed the dishes while I dried. We talked about small things. I did not mention the signal. He did not either. After he left, I sat in Margaret's chair by the window for a long time, the one she used to read in. I thought about how Nathaniel had set that spoon down 3 times. I thought about how the signal had traveled 24 years and 1,000 unspoken things, and still worked. Clean as a key in a lock. Then I rang a woman called Winifred Tahir. Winnie was my colleague at Customs for 19 years. She left 5 years before I did to take a senior role at the Financial Markets Authority. And she's one of the sharpest minds I've ever worked beside. She also owes me a favor from a matter in 2014. I won't describe in detail, but that she has not forgotten. I rang her at 7:30 on a Sunday evening. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Duncan," she said, "it must be important. I need a proper look at a name," I said. "Veterinary nurse, Auckland, living somewhere around Remuera or Newmarket. Name's Imogen Whitcomb. Might also go by a variation. I'd like to know everything that doesn't fit." She rang me back on Tuesday evening. I was in the garden, thinning carrots, when my phone buzzed in my shirt pocket. "Duncan," she said. "You'll want to sit down." I sat down on an overturned bucket. "Go on." "Imogen Whitcomb is her real name," Winnie said. That part checked out. But the brother in Whitianga doesn't exist. She has one sibling, a sister, who lives in Brisbane and hasn't been back to New Zealand in 7 years. And the diploma from Massey, the veterinary nursing qualification, is genuine. But she was suspended from practice for 11 months in 2021. A complaint from a client. What kind of complaint? Financial. An elderly woman whose golden retriever had been at the clinic for a long stay after surgery. Imogen had befriended her, visited at her home a few times, apparently helped out with some shopping while the dog was recovering. The woman ended up lending her $18,000 for what Imogen described as an urgent family matter. The money was never repaid. The woman's daughter filed the complaint. Imogen said it had been a gift. It was settled through mediation, and the suspension was the professional outcome. I sat on that bucket with the carrots in my hand and felt the cold Auckland evening settle around me. "There's more," Winnie said. "Tell me." 2 other names have come up attached to her over the last 8 years. A man she lived with briefly in Hamilton around 2017, a widower in his 60s, who ended up selling a rental property and transferring a sum to a joint account that was then withdrawn in parts. He never filed a complaint. He told a neighbor he had been stupid and didn't want his children to know. He died last year, apparently of natural causes. And a man in Tauranga, another older gentleman, whose adult daughter raised concerns with the police 2 years ago, when she noticed her father had taken out a second mortgage without explanation. The investigation went nowhere because the father insisted it was his own decision and refused to cooperate. "Winnie," I said, "my son is 34. I know," she said gently. "My son is a structural engineer with a clean credit history and an inheritance block he doesn't know what to do with." "I know," she said. "Duncan, she's not after your son. Your son is the route. She's after the property on the Coromandel, or whatever she thinks comes next. Your son is the vehicle. And frankly, given your financial position, you might also be a secondary target." I thought about the Stargazer lilies, Margaret's favorite. I thought about how Imogen had known exactly which jumper to wear, exactly when to look at the photograph and look away, exactly which question to ask me about customs work. "I need to talk to Nathaniel," I said. "You need to be very careful about how," Winnie said. "If he's emotionally in, and you come in with accusations before you have something he can see with his own eyes, you'll lose him. I've watched it happen. These women, these people, they're very good at making the family member look like the bitter one, the jealous one, the father who doesn't want to let go." "I know," I said. "I've seen it from the other side of the desk more times than I can count. I want to explain something here that most people don't understand about this kind of fraud, because it's the part where I used to lose family members in interview rooms. The part where they would say, 'But why didn't he just see it?' The answer is that by the time the ask comes, seeing it isn't a simple thing anymore." Imogen had been in Nathaniel's life for 5 months. 5 months of dinners and weekend walks along Takapuna Beach, and quiet Sunday mornings, and careful, attentive listening. 5 months of being the person who showed up for him in the particular gentle way he had needed since the divorce, since his mother's death, since the long solitary stretch that had preceded her. Every moment of warmth was a brick in a wall, designed to make him feel that doubting her meant doubting his own judgment, his own worthiness, his own right to be loved again at all. The signal told me he already felt something was off, probably something very small. Too small for him to name. A moment where her story about the rostering didn't quite line up. A comment she made about his grandfather's block that had sat strangely in his chest afterwards. A feeling. Nothing more. But feeling something is wrong and being ready to dismantle 5 months of carefully constructed hope are 2 entirely different things. I needed to give him something he could not argue with. Something that would make the choice simple. So I set a trap. I rang Nathaniel on the Wednesday morning. I told him I'd been thinking about the Coromandel block, that I knew it was his and not mine, but that I'd always intended to help him think through it, and that I'd been slow about it because of Margaret, and I wanted to make it right now. I asked if he might bring Imogen round on Saturday for a proper conversation, the three of us. Maybe I could walk them through how I'd have approached selling or leasing a piece of land like that back in my working days. There was a small pause. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, that'd be good, Dad. She actually mentioned her brother again last night. Said he's keen to have a look." "Is that right?" I said. "Yeah," he said. "I said we'd talk about it with you. Saturday," I said. 11. "I'll make something decent for lunch." I hung up. I stood in the garden for a long time. I spent the week preparing. I rang a former colleague called Benedict Oakley, a man who had moved from customs to private investigation work 10 years ago, and now ran a small firm in Ellerslie that did mostly insurance and commercial matters. I explained the situation. He said he would come round on Saturday morning, early, park out of sight down the street, and hold himself ready. I asked Winnie to prepare a printed summary of what she'd found, professional, on letterhead, the kind of document that changes the temperature of a room when it's placed on a table. I rang my bank and put a 7-day alert flag on my accounts, which I did not expect to need, but which 34 years of the job had taught me to set anyway. And on Thursday evening I rang Nathaniel. Not about any of this. Just to talk. About the Queenstown project. About a book he was reading. About whether he wanted to come for a proper walk at Long Bay on Sunday, after all the business was done. He sounded a little tired. A little distracted. But he said yes to the walk, and he said he loved me before he hung up, which he does not say often. And I sat in the kitchen afterwards and thought about how Imogen had known exactly which way to lean in. Saturday came. I made a simple lunch. Quiche, salad, fresh bread from the bakery in Howick. I laid out a folder on the kitchen table with the Coromandel title details. Some printouts I'd prepared about land value trends in that part of the country. I made it look like I was taking this seriously. They arrived at 11 sharp. Imogen had brought another small gift, a pot of herbs this time, a little bay tree for the garden. She set it on the bench and hugged me briefly, and called me Duncan, which felt like she had decided, in the intervening week, that she had earned it. We sat at the kitchen table. I walked them through the block's details slowly, carefully. I asked Nathaniel questions about his own plans. I asked Imogen what her brother's timeline was looking like. She answered in soft, competent sentences. The brother was ready to move within 3 months, she said. He had pre-approval. He would be paying fair market value. She assured me. He wasn't trying to get a mate's discount or anything of that sort. Wonderful, I said. I think the first step is probably a proper valuation. I've got a cousin, actually, who does that sort of work in Thames. Oh, lovely, she said. And before any transaction, I'd want to run the usual checks. I'm old-fashioned about these things. Of course, she said. Of course. I'd also want to have the buyer's financial position reviewed. Nothing invasive, just a standard due diligence process. I have someone at the FMA who does that kind of thing very quickly. Her fingers, which had been resting on the handle of her teacup, went still. Of course, she said. Her name's Winifred Tahere. I said. She was with Customs for nearly 20 years before she moved across. She and I worked a lot of cases together. Real bulldog. That one. She paused, I think, on some sort of matter involving a veterinary clinic a few years back. Can't remember the details. Funny coincidence, isn't it? The room changed. Imogen's smile did not change. She was far too practiced for that. But her eyes went flat, the way a cat's eyes go flat the moment it decides the bird is too much trouble. Nathaniel looked at me. Then he looked at her. Sorry, he said. Winifred Tahere? Dad's mentioned her. Imogen said smoothly. A few times over lunch. I think she sounds fascinating. That's funny, Nathaniel said. I don't think Dad's ever mentioned her. He had, actually. Once, 18 months ago. In passing, the silence lasted 4 seconds. I counted them. I've counted longer silences across interview tables. Then Imogen stood up. She said she just remembered she needed to make a phone call, and could she step outside for a moment? And Nathaniel nodded, and she took her handbag with her, which told me everything I still needed to know. I walked to the kitchen window. Her car started almost immediately. I watched the taillights turn out of the driveway. I went back into the kitchen. Benedict was already coming up the drive from where he had been waiting. He knocked. I let him in. And he and Nathaniel and I sat at the table while I told Nathaniel everything. I laid Winnie's summary in front of him. He read it. He read it again. He did not speak for a long time. Then he stood up and walked to the sink and stood with his back to me. Both hands braced on the counter. "Dad," he said, "how long have you known?" "I suspected a week ago," I said. "I had it confirmed on Tuesday." "Why didn't you tell me on Tuesday?" "Because if I'd come at you on Tuesday," I said, "you'd have heard me as a father who didn't want his son to move on. You'd have defended her. You'd have fought me, and she'd still be in your life. And I'd be the enemy. And we would lose each other, and she would still win." He was quiet. "I rang you Wednesday morning," I said. "I told you what I told you, so that you'd bring her here today, and so that you'd see her face when she understood the game was finished. I needed you to see it. I needed you to not have to take my word for it." He turned around. His eyes were wet, but he was not crying. He looked like his mother in the last good week before she died, when she had made every decision left to her calmly and in order. "I used the signal," he said. "I know," I said. "I heard it. I didn't know I remembered," he said. "I didn't know it was still in me." She said, "The thing about her brother and I felt my hand move before I'd thought about it. I didn't even know I was doing it until I'd already done it. And then I thought, oh, Dad taught me that." Benedict, who is a tactful man, excused himself to the porch and said he'd ring the relevant people and give us the hour. Nathaniel sat back down at the table. He picked up Winnie's summary again. He read the parts about the man in Hamilton, about the man in Tauranga. He read the complaint from the elderly client with the golden retriever. "The man in Hamilton died last year," he said. "Yes, and his children never knew." "Probably not," I said. "That's how these things work. Embarrassment keeps a great deal buried." He put the paper down. "Dad," he said, "is this going to go anywhere? Properly, I mean. Will anyone hold her to account?" "That depends," I said. "Your case, if you want to pursue it, is strong. The pattern with the others gives it weight. Winnie is already in conversation with the FMA about referring the earlier matters back to the police, now that a fresh incident is on record. The family of the Hamilton man may be willing to speak now that someone else has come forward. These things move slowly, but they do move. I want to make a statement," he said immediately. "I want everything I know on record. Every text, every email, every conversation I can remember clearly. If her pattern is what this says it is, and the Tauranga father didn't cooperate, and the Hamilton man is dead, then I'm the one who can actually do something. So I'm going to do something." I was not surprised, but I was proud. In the particular way you can only be proud of your children, the way that belongs entirely to them, and not at all to you. We spent the rest of that afternoon at the kitchen table. I made tea. Benedict came back in and took notes. Nathaniel pulled up his phone, and we went through his messages with her methodically, flagging anything that might matter, screenshotting the exchanges about the Coromandel block, the offhand mentions of her brother, the photographs she had sent that we now looked at differently. At one point he stopped and put his hand over mine on the table. "I'm glad you made the signal with me," he said. "I'm glad it was still there. It was your mother's idea," I told him. After the business at the Andersons' place, she said a child needs a way to ask for help that doesn't feel like asking. He was quiet for a moment. I forgot that part, he said. I forgot it was her idea. Most of the good ideas were, I said. The investigation opened formally within 3 weeks. Benedict coordinated with Winnie, and the FMA liaised with the police, and 2 of the earlier complainants' family members agreed to provide statements. The daughter of the Hamilton man, contacted carefully, said her father had been too embarrassed to speak while he was alive, but that she had always known something had happened to him, and she would speak now on his behalf. The Tauranga father was contacted too. He did not participate, but his adult daughter did, and what she provided was substantial. I do not know yet where any of it will end. These things move slowly in this country, and they should, because the law is careful and people's lives are serious. But they are moving. Nathaniel took a fortnight off in November. He came round most evenings. We didn't talk much about Imogen. There wasn't all that much left to say. We worked on the garden instead. I'd been wanting to put in a small orchard at the back, a feijoa and a couple of apples and a plum, the kinds of trees Margaret had always wanted and never got around to planting. Nathaniel dug the holes. I stood with him and held the stakes. On the last evening before he went back to work, he helped me hang a small watercolor in the hallway, a painting of the Coromandel coast Margaret had bought at a market in Whitianga when he was a boy. It had been in the spare room for years. He said it deserved better. We stood back and looked at it, and it sat alongside Margaret's photograph on the hall table in a way that felt right. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Always, in your work, when you had a strong feeling about someone, did you ever think you might be wrong?" "Every time," I said. "That's why you build the case. A feeling isn't enough. You have to find what's underneath the feeling." He nodded slowly. "The signal was the feeling," he said, "and the work after was the proof." "That's about right," I said. He looked at Margaret's photograph for a while. I thought about telling him something else, but I waited, because I could see he was working something out. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the block on the Coromandel. I don't want to sell it. Not to her brother, obviously, but not to anyone else either. Not right now. I want to put a small place on it one day. Somewhere for family. I want it to be the kind of thing Mum would have wanted. A place where we could all go." I thought that sounded like a very good idea. "I also think," he said, "that I want to talk to younger blokes at work about what happened. Not in any detail, but this sort of thing, romance, fraud, financial abuse. It doesn't get talked about when the person targeted is a 34-year-old man. Everyone assumes it happens only to elderly widows. I want to say something. Third graders could do with that too," I said. "Your mother used to say that. She used to say kids need a way to ask for help that doesn't feel like asking. I think the same is true of grown men. We need a way to admit we've been taken in that doesn't feel like an admission of being stupid. Because being taken in isn't about being stupid. It's about being hopeful. It's about being human." He left around 9 that night. I stood on the veranda and listened to his car go down the drive, and I waited until I couldn't hear it anymore. Then I went inside and turned off the lights, room by room, the way I do every night. In the hallway I stopped, and I looked at the photograph of Margaret and the little Coromandel watercolor beside it, and I thought about how every important thing in our lives had come from her in one way or another. The signal, the stubbornness, the boy who had grown into the man who had used the signal at the right moment. I tapped the wall gently, 3 times with 2 fingers. Then I went to bed. If you are watching this, and you are a parent or a grandparent, or anyone at all who loves someone, I want to say this plainly. Teach the people you love a way to ask for help that doesn't feel like asking. Make it small. Make it ordinary. A tap, a gesture, a particular word in a particular place. You may never need it. You may need it once in a lifetime. But a signal like that does not fade. It waits. It waits for the afternoon you are buttering a scone and your son is 34 years old and the woman across the table is smiling and something in the room is wrong and no one else in the world knows it but the two of you. And if you are watching this, and you are the person who has felt something is off in your own life, something small, something you cannot quite name, please listen to that feeling. It is not nothing. It is information your mind has gathered before your language caught up. You do not have to have proof yet. You do not have to dismantle your whole life yet. But please, tell someone, a parent, a sibling, an old friend, a professional. Say the feeling out loud. Even if you cannot defend it, the people who love you will do the work of proof. That is what they are for. And if you are alone, and there is no one to tap a spoon to, ring the police. Ring a helpline. Ring age concern. Ring anyone. There are people in this country whose whole job is to listen to the feeling and help you find what is underneath it. You do not have to carry it by yourself. Margaret used to say that families are just a series of small rooms with doors, and the job of love is to keep the doors from locking. I think she was right. I think a signal, any signal, is just a way of saying, the door is still open, and I am still on the other side of it, and I am listening. Thank you for listening to this story. Take care of the people you love. Teach them a signal. And if you ever hear 3 small taps at a table, look up.